The temperature had dropped to nearly 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The sea was unnaturally still. No wind, no waves, no sound beyond the deep mechanical heartbeat of four massive steam engines pushing 46 Euro 0 tons of steel through water so cold it could kill a man in minutes. Lookout Frederick Fleet stood inside the crow's nest, his breath turning white in the frozen air, his eyes scanning a darkness so absolute it felt like the edge of the world itself. Then he saw it. Not a mountain, not a coastline, something darker than the night. A mass of ancient ice born from glaciers older than civilization, drifting silently into the path of the most celebrated ship ever built. Fleet grabbed the telephone. His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white. Iceberg, right ahead. 3 words. 37 seconds to impact. It was not enough. What happened in the next 2 hours and 40 minutes would become one of the most documented, analyzed, mourned, and studied events in human history. Over 500 people would die in water so cold the human body loses consciousness in under 15 minutes. And yet, more than a century later, 563 days after the ship slipped beneath the surface, the world still cannot look away. To understand why, we must go back. Not to the disaster itself, but to the dream that made it possible. The year was 1907. 2 men sat in a London dining room. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, and Lord William Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast. Outside, the city was alive with the electricity of progress. The automobile was reshaping roads. Wireless telegraphy was connecting continents. The world felt for the first time in history like a place that could be fully mastered. Over dinner, the 2 men sketched a vision that would consume the next 5 years of thousands of lives. Not 1 ship, but 3. Each one larger than anything ever constructed by human hands. Each one a floating monument to the belief that engineering had finally conquered nature itself. They named the first Olympic, the second, Titanic. The choice of name was deliberate. In Greek mythology, the Titans were beings of enormous power, who challenged the gods, and were ultimately destroyed for their ambition. Whether the men in that dining room saw the irony is unclear. What is certain is that they never considered failure a real possibility. Construction began in Belfast in 1909. At the peak of building, over 15 Waruziran workers flooded the Harland and Wolff yards every morning. Men as young as 14 carried white-hot rivets in buckets, sprinting between scaffolds to keep pace with an assembly line that never slowed. In 3 years, they placed over 3 million rivets by hand into a hull stretching nearly 900 feet long. They built not just a ship, but a city that could float, with Turkish baths, a squash court, a swimming pool, first-class staterooms lined with mahogany and velvet, and a third-class section that, despite its lower status, offered conditions better than most European immigrants had ever known. The Titanic was, in every measurable sense, the greatest thing humanity had ever made. That was the problem. When a culture convinces itself that something cannot fail, it stops asking the question that matters most. What happens if it does? The Passenger Manifest told the story of a world in motion. In first class, industrialists and socialites occupied suites that cost the equivalent of $100,000 in today's currency. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, traveled with his young bride, returning from a honeymoon in Europe. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, walked the promenade deck each morning with his wife Ida, married for decades, inseparable in the way only people who have truly chosen each other can be. In second class, doctors, teachers, and clergy occupied comfortable cabins and dined at tables set with proper silverware. Many were professionals starting fresh in America, carrying degrees and ambitions in leather briefcases. And in third class, deep in the lower decks, in the belly of the ship, over 700 emigrants filled their quarters with languages from across the world. Irish families fleeing poverty, Lebanese merchants chasing trade, Swedish farmers seeking land, Finnish workers with calloused hands and careful savings sewn into the lining of their coats. They had sold everything they owned for this crossing. For them, The Titanic was not a luxury. It was the threshold between one life and another. They carried babies. They carried photographs. They carried the names of cousins who had written letters back from cities like New York and Boston and Chicago. Letters that said, "Come. There is work here, there is space, there is a future." On the night of April 14th, most of them were asleep. At 11:39 p.m., First Officer William Murdoch received Fleet's warning and issued two commands simultaneously: hard to starboard and full stop on the engines. For 37 seconds, the ship's 46,000-ton body struggled to respond. The iceberg scraped along the starboard hull below the waterline. Not a catastrophic collision, but a quiet, almost surgical wound, popping rivets and opening seams across 5 watertight compartments. The designer had calculated the ship could stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded. The ice had touched 5. Below decks, men in the boiler rooms heard a sound like distant thunder. Some saw the wall buckle. Water began entering not as a flood but as a rush, cold, black, unstoppable. Within minutes, the lowest compartments were filling. The ship, still lit from bow to stern, still humming with life, was already dying. Most passengers felt nothing more than a slight shudder, like a train switching tracks. A few went up to the deck out of curiosity and saw chunks of ice scattered across the bow. Some kicked them around. Someone suggested they were souvenirs. Nobody panicked. Not yet. It was 11:45 p.m. The Titanic had approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes left. Was it hubris? Bad luck? A series of small failures cascading into catastrophe? In the decades that followed, investigators, historians, and engineers would argue endlessly about the answer. But perhaps what matters most is not the single cause. It is the chain of choices, each one reasonable on its own. Each one link in a sequence no one saw forming. That chain, in the freezing dark of the North Atlantic, was almost complete. It took Thomas Andrews exactly 12 minutes to understand what no one else on that ship wanted to believe. Andrews was not a passenger in the traditional sense. He was the Titanic's chief designer, the man who had spent 3 years turning blueprints into steel, who knew every corridor, every valve, every seam of the ship as intimately as a surgeon knows the body he has spent a lifetime studying. When Captain Edward John Smith summoned him below deck shortly after midnight, Andrews descended without rushing. He carried a clipboard. He moved methodically through each flooded compartment, measuring, calculating, checking water levels against mental maps he had memorized years ago in the drafting rooms of Belfast. Then he stopped. He looked at Captain Smith with the expression of a man who has just solved an equation he desperately wished would come out differently. "She can float with 4 compartments flooded," he said quietly. "She has 5. She will sink." "Certainly." Smith asked how long they had. Andrews did not look away. An hour and a half, perhaps 2. Not much longer. In that moment, in a narrow corridor somewhere in the lower decks of the grandest ship ever built, the fate of 224 human beings had already been decided by mathematics. The only question remaining, the one that would haunt survivors, investigators, and historians for over a century, was not whether people would die. It was which people. The lifeboats told that story with brutal clarity. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. On paper, that number satisfied the maritime regulations of the time. Regulations written in 1894, when ships were a fraction of the Titanic's size. Regulations that had never been updated to account for vessels carrying over 2,000 souls. The lifeboats had a combined capacity of approximately 178 people. There were 224 people on board. Even that math was generous, because what no one had practiced, not once during the entire voyage, was an actual lifeboat drill. Officers knew the theory, crew members knew the locations, but in the cold confusion of a ship listing slowly to one side, with rockets being fired overhead, and the orchestra still playing in the first-class lounge, nobody knew exactly what to do, and the results were catastrophic. Lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered at 12:40 a.m. It had a capacity of 65 people. It left with 28. Lifeboat after lifeboat descended into the dark water with dozens of empty seats. partly from poor coordination, partly from passengers who refused to believe the situation was truly dire, partly because many third-class passengers were never effectively directed to the boat deck at all. The gates that separated steerage from upper decks were not locked. That myth, vivid and dramatic as it seems, was largely disproven in later investigations. But the confusion, the language barriers, the unfamiliarity with the ship's layout, and the absence of crew members guiding them upward meant that hundreds of emigrants spent precious minutes wandering corridors that grew colder and darker by the minute. On the boat deck, the contrast was almost incomprehensible. First-class passengers stood in fur coats waiting for officers to assist them aboard with the same courtesy they had received at dinner. Some refused to board at all, unwilling to leave their husbands or convinced the ship was safer than a small wooden boat on a freezing ocean at 1 in the morning. Margaret Brown, a woman history would later nickname the unsinkable Molly Brown, took matters into her own hands, loading women and children into lifeboats with the efficiency of someone who had never learned to wait for permission. And still, the boats left half empty. Below all of this, the musicians played. Wallace Hartley led his 8-piece band on the first-class deck, and the music they produced that night entered history not as performance, but as an act of profound, deliberate courage. For over 2 hours, in coats that did not keep out the cold, with full awareness of what was happening beneath their feet, they played. Ragtime, hymns, waltzes, filling the freezing air with sound that told the passengers wordlessly, "Remain calm, be human, hold together." None of them survived. Their final song has been debated for over a century. Some survivors insisted it was the hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee." Others said it was a ragtime piece called Autumn. The truth may never be known with certainty. What is certain is that they played until there was no longer a deck to stand on. By 1:15 a.m., the bow was submerged deep enough that water was lapping the name Titanic itself, still painted in crisp white letters on the hull. The ship's angle was becoming undeniable. Furniture began sliding, dishes crashed. The grand staircase, with its ornate oak banisters and gilded clock, groaned as the geometry it was built for became impossible. Isidore Strauss, the department store magnate who had walked the promenade deck with his wife every morning, was offered a seat in a lifeboat. He refused. He would not take a spot while other men remained on deck. His wife Ida was offered her own seat, and refused with words that have echoed through every subsequent retelling. "Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together in deck chairs, holding hands as the water rose. In the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had been transmitting distress signals since 12:15 a.m. The closest ship, the Carpathia, was 58 miles away and had turned immediately toward them, pushing its engines beyond safe limits, racing through iceberg-laden waters in the dark. It would take 4 hours to arrive. The Titanic did not have 4 hours. The Californian was closer, perhaps as close as 10 miles. Its wireless operator had gone to sleep. On its bridge, officers watched rockets being fired into the sky and debated among themselves what they might mean. They did nothing. At 2:17 a.m., the forward funnel collapsed. The lights, which had stayed on through almost the entire sinking, a testament to the engineers in the boiler rooms who stayed at their posts until the very end, flickered once, then went out completely. The Titanic broke in two. The stern rose nearly vertical, paused for a moment that survivors would describe as feeling like an eternity, and then, with a sound like no sound any of them had ever heard, slipped beneath the surface. What remained was darkness, ice, and the screaming. Over 500 people were now in water that registered 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia at that temperature renders a person unconscious within 15 minutes. The screaming, described by every survivor who gave testimony, lasted for nearly 20 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was, by many accounts, the most terrifying sound of all. In the lifeboats floating a safe distance away, hundreds of survivors sat wrapped in blankets and shock, listening. A handful of boats rowed back into the debris field to search for survivors. Most did not. The reasons given later varied. fear of being swamped by desperate swimmers, panic, paralysis. Only Lifeboat 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, returned to the wreckage. They pulled 4 people alive from the water. 4. Bloco 3, 41, 563 days and the weight of memory. The Carpathia arrived at 4:10 a.m. Captain Arthur Rostron had driven his ship through iceberg fields in absolute darkness, doubling the lookout posts, ordering every available blanket and cup of hot broth to be prepared, pushing engines that were never designed for the speed he demanded from them. When his crew looked over the railing into the pre-dawn dark and saw the first lifeboat, small, overloaded, drifting in silence among debris that stretched as far as any eye could see, several of them wept openly. Over the next 4 hours, the Carpathia pulled 710 survivors from the water and from the lifeboats. They came aboard wrapped in shock so deep that some could not speak for hours. A woman named Rosa Abbott had been pulled directly from the ocean, one of only a handful of people to survive full immersion in those waters. She had lost both of her sons in the wreckage. She sat on the deck of the Carpathia wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing, her lips moving in words no one around her could hear. 710 survivors. 1. 5 on 17 dead. When the Carpathia docked in New York on the night of April 18th, over 40 Auzuzeran people were waiting at Pier 54 in the rain. They stood in silence as the survivors disembarked, some carried, some walking slowly, all of them wearing borrowed clothes, all of them carrying a weight that no pier, no city, no amount of time would ever fully lift from their shoulders. The world received the news the way worlds receive catastrophes that don't fit inside existing categories. It was not a war. It was not a plague. It was a ship. The safest, grandest, most celebrated vessel in human history that had sailed 4 days into its maiden voyage and ceased to exist. Newspapers from London to Buenos Aires ran headlines in the largest type their presses could produce. Telegraph offices were overwhelmed. Stock markets paused. In the Irish town of Queenstown, the Titanic's last port of call before the open Atlantic, families who had waved goodbye to emigrating relatives now gathered in silence outside church doors, waiting for lists that would take days to arrive. What followed was not just grief, it was reckoning. The British and American inquiries that launched within days of the sinking uncovered a portrait of institutional failure, so layered and so revealing that it forced entire industries to rebuild themselves. Wireless regulations were overhauled. Never again would a ship's radio operator be allowed to simply go to sleep. Lifeboat requirements were rewritten to mandate that every vessel carry enough boats for every soul aboard, not for a fraction of them. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor North Atlantic icebergs, a service that continues to this day. But beneath the regulatory reforms, something deeper had cracked. The Titanic sailed in an era that genuinely believed, not as metaphor, but as a kind of secular faith, that human ingenuity had reached a level where certain failures were no longer possible. The great industrial powers of Europe and North America had built railways across continents, laid telegraph cables across ocean floors, constructed buildings that touched the clouds. Progress was not a direction, it was a destination, and they believed, with remarkable sincerity, that they were nearly there. The Titanic's sinking did not merely disprove that belief, it dismantled the psychological architecture that made it possible. 2 years later, the First World War would complete the demolition, but April 15, 1912, at 2:20 in the morning, was the moment the first wall came down. The 20th century, in many ways, began at the bottom of the North Atlantic. For 73 years, the wreck remained unseen. It lay at a depth of 12,500 feet, in darkness so complete and pressure so immense that no technology could reach it. It became, in its invisibility, something almost mythological, a place more imagined than real, described only through survivor testimony, architectural drawings, and the strange mathematics of how a ship that size would have fallen through 2 miles of water before striking the ocean floor. Then, on September 1, 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard's expedition located the wreck. The first images transmitted back to the surface, grainy, Green-tinted frames showing a massive boiler emerging from the silt caused grown scientists to cry at their monitoring stations. The ship was real. It had always been real. But seeing it confirmed something that decades of storytelling had almost transformed into abstraction. The Titanic was not a legend. It was a place where real people had lived their last hours. The images that followed over subsequent expeditions revealed a debris field 2 miles long. Not just steel and machinery, but the intimate wreckage of interrupted lives. A child's leather shoe. A porcelain doll's head resting upright in the silt as though carefully placed. A leather suitcase still closed, its brass latches still fastened around clothes that a young emigrant had packed with hopeful hands in a European bedroom that no longer existed. Thousands of dishes, champagne bottles, a safe, open and empty. The bronze cherub that had decorated the first-class staircase newel post, separated now from everything it once illuminated. The wreck is deteriorating. Marine biologists studying the site have identified a form of bacteria, named Halomonas titanicae, that is slowly consuming the iron hull. Experts estimate that within the next 20 to 50 years, the physical structure of the Titanic will have collapsed entirely, leaving only the non-organic materials, the glass, the ceramic, the coal, scattered in the silt where a ship once stood. The ocean, patient and indifferent, is finishing what it started. And yet, 113 years, 563 days, and the world still cannot look away. Films, books, museum exhibitions, university courses, deep-sea expeditions, entire academic careers, all built around a ship that existed for 4 days of its intended life. The question worth sitting with is not how this happened, but why we cannot release it. Perhaps because the Titanic is not really a story about a ship at all. It is a story about the distance between what we build and what we are. About the seductive, dangerous comfort of believing that enough wealth, enough technology, enough confidence can insulate a human life from the fundamental uncertainties that define it. Every person aboard that ship, from John Jacob Astor reading in his first-class suite to the young Lithuanian farmer sleeping in steerage with his savings sewn into his coat, had placed their trust in a structure built by other humans, certified by institutions, blessed by the culture of progress that surrounded them all. And the ice did not care. It never does. The Titanic's deepest lesson is not about maritime safety or corporate hubris or class inequality, though it contains all of those things. Its deepest lesson is about humility, the specific, difficult humility of acknowledging that there is no ship large enough, no hull thick enough, no engineering precise enough to guarantee the future, that the gap between what we can build and what we can control remains after all this time as wide as the North Atlantic itself. Ida Strauss refused a seat in a lifeboat to stay beside her husband. Wallace Hartley raised his bow and kept playing. The engineers in the boiler room stayed at their stations until the water took them. Somewhere in the dark, Rosa Abbott held her boys as long as she could. These were not extraordinary people in ordinary circumstances. They were ordinary people in an extraordinary moment, which is what most of us are, most of the time, whether we know it yet or not. The Titanic descended to the bottom of the Atlantic in 2 hours and 40 minutes, but it has been rising slowly in the memory of the world, every single day since 563 days, and counting. Fim da narrativa. Se esta narrativa tocou algo em você, deixa o like aqui embaixo e se inscreve no canal. Cada história que contamos é construída com o mesmo cuidado e profundidade que você acabou de ler. A próxima narrativa está chegando.